Reflections of a Russian Statesman by Konstantin Petrovich Pobyedonostseff. Chapter 3. The Great Falsehood of Our Time. That which is founded on falsehood cannot be right. Institutions founded on false principles cannot be other than false themselves. This truth has been demonstrated by the bitter experience of ages and generations. Among the falsest of political principles is the principle of the sovereignty of the people, the principle that all power issues from the people, and all based upon the national will, a principle which has unhappily become more firmly established since the time of the French Revolution. Thence proceeds the theory of parliamentarism, which, up to the present day, has deluded much of the so-called intelligence, and unhappily infatuated certain foolish Russians. It continues to maintain its hold on many minds with the obstinacy of narrow fanaticism, although every day its falsehood is exposed more clearly to the world. In what does the theory of parliamentarism consist? It is supposed that the people in its assemblies make its own laws and elects responsible officers to execute its will. Such is the ideal conception. Its immediate realization is impossible. The historical development of society necessitates that local communities increase in numbers and in complexity. Separate races are assimilated or retain their polities and languages, unite under a single flag, that territory extend indefinitely. Under such conditions, direct government by the people is impracticable. The people must, therefore, delegate its right of power to its representatives and invest them with administrative autonomy. These representatives, in turn, cannot govern immediately, but are compelled to elect a still smaller number of trustworthy persons, ministers, to whom they entrust the preparation and execution of the laws, the appropriation and collection of taxes, the appointment of subordinate officials, and the disposition of the military forces. In the abstract, this mechanism is quite symmetrical. For its proper operation, many conditions are essential. The working of the political machine is based on impersonal forces, constantly acting and completely balanced. It may act successfully only when the delegates of the people abdicate their personalities, when on the benches of Parliament sit mechanical fulfillers of the people's behests, when ministers of state remain impersonal, execute executors of the will of the majority, when the elected representatives of the people are capable of understanding precisely and executing conscientiously the program of activity, mathematically expressed, which has been delivered to them. Given such conditions, the machine would work exactly and would accomplish its purpose. The law would actually embody the will of the people. Administrative measures would actually emanate from Parliament. The pillars of the state would rest actually on the elective assemblies, and each citizen would directly and consciously participate in the management of public affairs. Such is the theory. Let us look at the practice. Even in classic countries of parliamentarism, it would satisfy not one of the conditions enumerated. The elections in no way express the will of the electors. The popular representatives are in no way restricted by the opinions of their constituents, but are guided by their own views and considerations, modified by the tactics of their opponents. In reality, ministers are autocratic, and they rule rather than are ruled by Parliament. They attain power and lose power, not by virtue of the will of the people, but through immense personal influence, or the influence of a strong party which places them in power or drives them from it. They dispose of the force and resources of the nation at will. They grant immunities and favors. They maintain a multitude of idlers at the expense of the people, and they fear no censure while they enjoy the support in Parliament of a majority which they maintain by the distribution of bounties from the rich tables which the state has put at their disposal. In reality, the ministers are as irresponsible as the representatives of the people. Mistakes, abuse of power, and arbitrary acts are of daily occurrence. Yet how often do we hear of the grave responsibility of a minister? It may be once in 50 years a minister is tried for his crimes, with a result contemptible when compared with the celebrity gained by the solemn procedure. Were we to attempt a true definition of Parliament, we should say that Parliament is an institution serving for the satisfaction of the personal ambition, vanity, and self-interest of its members. The institution of Parliament is indeed one of the greatest illustrations of human delusion. Enduring in the course of centuries the tyranny of autocratic and oligarchical governments, and ignoring that the evils of autocracy are the evils of society itself, men of intellect and knowledge have laid the responsibility for their misfortunes on their rulers and on their systems of government, and imagined that by substituting for these systems government by the will of the people, or representative government, society would be delivered from all the evils and violence which it endured. What is the result? The result is that, mutato nomine, all has remained essentially as before, and men, retaining the weaknesses and failings of their nature, have transfused in the new institutions their former impulses and tendencies. As before, they are ruled by personal will and in the interests of privileged persons. But this personal will is no longer embodied in the person of the sovereign, but in the person of the leader of a party. And privilege no longer belongs to an aristocracy of birth, but to majority ruling in Parliament and controlling the state. On the pediment of this edifice is inscribed, "All for the public good." This is no more than a lying formula. Parliamentarism is the triumph of egoism, its highest expression. All here are calculated to the service of the ego. In the parliamentary fiction, the representatives, as such, surrenders his personality and serves as the embodiment of the will and opinions of his constituents. In reality, the constituents in the very act of election surrender all their rights in favor of their representative. In his addresses and speeches, the candidate for election lays constant emphasis upon this fiction. He reiterates his phrases about the public welfare. He is nothing but a servant of the people. He will forget himself and his interests for its sake. But these are words alone, temporary steps of the staircase by which he climbs to the height he aspires to, and which he casts away when he needs them no longer. Then, so far from beginning to work for society, society becomes the instrument of his aims. To him, his constituents are a herd, an aggregation of votes, and he, as their possessor, resembles those rich nomads whose flocks constitute their whole capital, the foundation of their power and eminence in society. Thus is developed to perfection the art of playing on the instincts and passions of the mass, in order to attain the personal ends of ambition and power. The people loses all importance for its representative, until the time arrives when it is to be played upon again. Then false and flattering and lying phrases are lavished as before. Some are suborned by bribery, others terrified by threats. The long chain of maneuvers spun which forms an invariable factor of parliamentarism. Yet this electoral farce continues to deceive humanity, and to be regarded as an institution which crowns the edifice of state. Poor humanity, in truth it may be said, mundus vult decepiatur. Thus, the representative principle works in practice. The ambitious man comes before his fellow citizens and strives by every means to convince them that he more than any other is worthy of their confidence. What motives impel him to this quest? It is hard to believe that he is impelled by disinterested zeal for the public good. In our time, nothing is so rare as men imbued with a feeling of solidarity with the people, ready for labor and self-sacrifice for the public good. This is the ideal nature, but such natures are little inclined to come into contact with the baseness of the world. He who, in consciousness of duty, is capable of disinterested service of the community does not descend to the soliciting of votes or the crying of his own praise at election meetings in loud and vulgar phrases. Such men manifest their strength in their own work, in a small circle of congenial friends, and scorn to seek popularity in the noisy marketplace. If they approach the crowd, it is not to flatter it or to pander to its basest instincts and tendencies, but to condemn its follies and expose its depravity. To men of duty and honor, the procedure of elections is repellent. The only men who regard it without abhorrence are selfish, egotistic natures, which wish thereby to attain their personal ends. To acquire popularity, such men have little scruple in assuming the mask of ardor for the public good. They cannot and must not be modest, for with modesty they would not be noticed or spoken of. By their positions and by the parts which they have chosen, they are forced to be hypocrites and liars. They must cultivate, fraternize with, and be amiable to their opponents to gain their suffrages. They must lavish promises, knowing that they cannot fulfill them, and they must pander to the basest tendencies and prejudices of the masses to acquire majorities for themselves. What honorable nature would accept such a role? Describe it in a novel, the reader would be repelled, but in elections, the same reader gives his vote to the living artiste in the same role. Parliamentary elections are a matter of art, having, as the military art, their strategy and tactics. The candidate is not brought into direct relations with his constituents. As intermediary stands the committee, a self-constituted institution, the chief weapon of which is impudence. The candidate, if he is unknown, begins by assembling a number of friends and patrons, then altogether organize a hunt among the rich and weak-minded aristocrats of the neighborhood, whom they convince that it is their duty, their prerogative, and their privilege to stand at the head as leaders of public opinion. There is little difficulty in finding stupid or idle people who are taken in by this trickery, and then, above their signatures, appear manifestos in the newspapers and on the walls and pillars, which seduce the mass, eager always in the pursuit of names, titles, and wealth. Thus are formed the committees which direct and control the elections. They resemble in much public companies. The composition of the committee is carefully elaborated. It contains some effective forces, energetic men who pursue at all costs material ends, while simple and frivolous idlers constitute the ballast. The committees organize meetings where speeches are delivered, where he who possesses a powerful voice and can quickly and skillfully string phrases together produces always an impression on the mass and acquires notoriety. Thus comes out the candidate for future election, who, with favoring conditions, may even supersede him whom he came to help. Phrases, and nothing but phrases, dominate these meetings. The crowd hears only him who cries the loudest, and who, with impudence and with flattery, conforms most artfully to the impulses and tendencies of the mob. On the day of polling, few give their votes intelligently. Those are the individual, influential electors whom it has been worthwhile to convince in private. The mass of the electors, after the practice of the herd, votes for one of the candidates nominated by the committees. Not one exactly knows the man, or considers his character, his capacity, his convictions. All vote merely because they have heard his name so often. It would be vain to struggle against this herd. If a level-headed elector wished to act intelligently in such a grave affair, and not to give way to the violence of the committee, he would have to abstain altogether, or to give his vote to his candidate according to his conviction. However he might act, he could not prevent the election of the candidate favored by the mass of frivolous, indifferent, and prejudiced electors. In theory, the elected candidate must be the favorite of the majority. In fact, he is the favorite of a minority, sometimes very small, by representing an organized force, while the majority, like sand, has no coherence, and is therefore incapable of resisting the clique and the faction. In theory, the election favors the intelligent and capable. In reality, it favors the pushing and impudent. It might be thought that education, experience, conscientiousness in work, and wisdom in affairs would be essential requirements in the candidate. In reality, whether these qualities exist or not, they are in no way needed in the struggle of the election, where the essential qualities are audacity, a combination of impudence and oratory, and even some vulgarity, which invariably acts on the masses. Modesty, in union with delicacy of feeling and thought, is worth nothing. Thus comes forth the representative of the people. Thus he acquires his power. How does he employ it? How will he turn it to advantage? If energetic by nature, he will attempt to form a party. If he is of an ordinary nature, then he joins himself to one party or another. The leader of a party, above all things, requires a resolute will. This is an organic quality, like physical strength, and does not by any means inevitably accompany moral excellence. With limited intellect and infinite egoism, and even wickedness, with base and dishonest tendencies, a man with a strong will may become a leader in Parliament, and may control the decisions of a party which contains men far surpassing him in moral and intellectual worth. Such may be the character of a ruling force in Parliament. To this should be joined another decisive force, eloquence. This also is a natural faculty, involving neither moral character nor high intellectual culture. A man may be a deep thinker, a poet, a skillful general, a subtle jurist, an experienced legislator, and at the same time may not enjoy the gift of fluent speech, while, on the contrary, one with ordinary intellectual capacity and knowledge may possess a special gift of eloquence. The union of this gift with a plenitude of intellectual power is a rare and exceptional phenomenon in parliamentary life. The most brilliant improvisations, which have given glory to orators and determined grave decisions, when read are as colorless and contemptible as descriptions of scenes enacted in former times by celebrated actors and singers. Experience shows that in great assemblies the decision does not belong to reason, but to daring and brilliancy, that the arguments most effective on the mass are not the most symmetrical, and must truly taken from the nature of things, but those expressed in sounding words and phrases, artfully selected, constantly reiterated, and calculated on the instinct of baseness, always dominant in the people. The masses are easily drawn by outbursts of empty declamation, and under such influences often form sudden decisions, which they regret on cold-blooded consideration of the affair. Therefore, when the leader of a party combines with a strong will the gift of eloquence, he assumes his first role on an open stage before the whole world. If he does not possess this gift, he stands like a stage manager behind the scenes and directs thence all the movements of the parliamentary spectacle, allotting the parts to others, appointing orators to speak for him, employing in his work all the rich but irresolute intellects of his party to do his thinking for him. What is a parliamentary party? In theory, it is an alliance of men with common convictions, joining forces for the realization of their views in legislation and administration. But this description applies only to small parties. The large party, which alone is an effective force in Parliament, is formed under the influence only of personal ambition and centers itself around one commanding personality. By nature, men are divided into two classes: those who tolerate no power above them, and therefore of necessity strive to rule others, and those who by their nature dread the responsibility inseparable from independent action, and who shrink from any resolute exercise of will. These were born for submission, and together constitute a herd, which follows the men of will and resolution, who form the minority. Thus, the most talented persons submit willingly and gladly entrust to stronger hands the control of affairs and the moral responsibility of their direction. Instinctively, they seek a leader and become his obedient instruments, inspired by the conviction that he will lead them to victory and, often, to spoil. Thus, all the important actions of Parliament are controlled by the leaders of the party, who inspire all decisions, who lead in combat and profit by victory. The public sessions are no more than a spectacle for the mass. Speeches are delivered to sustain the fiction of Parliament, but seldom a speech by itself affects the decision of Parliament in a grave affair. Speech-making serves for the glory of orators, for the increase of their popularity, and the making of their careers. Only on rare occasion does it affect the distribution of votes. Majorities and minorities are usually decided before the session begins. Such is the complicated mechanism of the parliamentary farce. Such is the great political lie which dominates our age. By the theory of parliamentarism, the rational majority must rule. In practice, the party is ruled by 5 or 6 of its leaders who exercise all power. In theory, decisions are controlled by clear arguments in the course of parliamentary debates. In practice, they in no wise depend from debates, but are determined by the wills of the leaders and the promptings of personal interest. In theory, the representatives of the people consider only the public welfare. In practice, their first consideration is their own advancement and the interests of their friends. In theory, they must be the best citizens. In practice, they are the most ambitious and impudent. In theory, the elector gives his votes for his candidate because he knows him and trusts him. In practice, the elector gives his vote for a man whom he seldom knows, but who has been forced on him by the speeches of an interested party. In theory, parliamentary business is directed by experience, good sense, and unselfishness. In practice, the chief motive powers are a firm will, egoism, and eloquence. Such is the parliamentary institution, exalted as the summit and crown of the edifice of state. It is sad to think that even in Russia, there are men who aspire to the establishment of this falsehood among us, that our professors glorify to their young pupils representative government as the ideal of political science, that our newspapers pursue it in their articles and feuilletons under the name of justice and order, without troubling to examine without prejudice the working of the parliamentary machine. Yet even where centuries have sanctified its existence, faith already decays. The liberal intelligence exalts it, but the people groans under its despotism and recognizes its falsehood. We may not see, but our children and grandchildren assuredly will see, the overthrow of this idol, which contemporary thought and its vanity continue still to worship. The philosophy of the school of Rousseau has done much evil to humanity. This philosophy took possession of many minds, but at the same time it was all based on one false idea of human perfectibility, and on the assumption, in every individual, of capacity to comprehend and appreciate those principles of social organization which it proclaimed. The prevalent doctrine of the perfection of democracy and of democratic government stands on the same delusive foundation. This doctrine presupposes the capacity of the people to understand subtleties of political science which have a clear and substantial existence in the minds of its apostles only. Precision of knowledge is attainable only by the few minds which constitute the aristocracy of intellect. The mass always and everywhere is vulgus, and its conceptions of necessity are vulgar. Democracy is the most complicated and the most burdensome system of government recorded in the history of humanity. For this reason, it has never appeared save as a transitory manifestation, with few exceptions giving place before long to other systems. It is in no way surprising. The duty of the state is to act and to ordain. Its dispositions are manifestations of a single will. Without this, government is inconceivable. But how can a multitude of men or a popular assembly act with a single will? The upholder of democracy takes little trouble over the decision of this question, but evades it by means of those favorite phrases and formulas: the will of the people, public opinion, the supreme decision of the nation, the voice of the people is the voice of God, and others of like nature. All these phrases signify that a multitude of men on a multitude of questions may form a common conclusion, and, conformably with their conclusion, arrive at a common decision. This may be possible sometimes, but only on the simplest questions. Where questions present the slightest complexity, their decision by a numerous assembly is possible only through the medium of men capable of judging them in all their details, and of persuading the people to accept their judgment. In the number of complex questions may be counted all political questions requiring great concentration of the intellectual forces of the most capable and experienced statesmen. On such questions, it would be absurd to rely on unanimity of thought and will in numerous assembly. The decision of the people could only be ruinous to the state. The enthusiasts of democracy contend that the state may manifest its will in affairs of state. This is a shallow theory. In reality, we find that popular assemblies are capable only of accepting, through enthusiasm, the opinion expressed by individuals or by a small minority. The opinion, for instance, of the recognized leader of their party, of some local worker of repute, of some organized association, or the impersonal opinion of an influential journal. Thus, the discussions which precede decision become an absurd comedy played on a vast stage by a multitude of heads and voices. The greater the multitude, the more unintelligible is the comedy, and the more the denouement depends upon fortuitous and disorderly impulses. To evade all these difficulties, the system of government by representation has been devised, a system first established and first justified by success in England. Thence, Through the influence of fashion, it spread to other European countries, but proved most successful only in the United States of America, and there by tradition and by right. Yet even in England, the land of their origin, representative institutions are in a critical epoch of their history. The very essence of the idea of representation has submitted already to modifications which have changed its primitive significance. In the beginning, the assemblies of electors, on a strictly limited franchise, sent to Parliament a certain number of persons whose duty it was to represent the opinions of the country, but who were not bound by any definite instructions from the mass of the constituents. It was assumed that these elected representatives were men who understood the real needs of their country and who were capable of justly controlling the politics of the state. The problem was resolved simply and plainly. It was required to lessen, as far as possible, the difficulties of government by the people by limiting in number the members of the assemblies summoned for the decision of questions of state. These men appeared in the capacity of free representatives of the people, and not as instruments of the opinions of factions. They were bound by no instructions. But in the course of time, this system changed under the influence of that fatal delusion about the great value of public opinion, as enlightened by the periodical press, which gave to the people the capacity to participate directly in the decision of political questions. The idea of representation altogether lost its form and reappeared in the idea of a mandate, or of specific commission. From this point of view, each representative is accounted as representative of the dominant opinions of his constituency, or of the party under the banner of which his victory was gained. Thus, he is no longer a representative of the country or of the people, but a delegate bound by the instructions of his party. This change in the very essence of the idea of representation was the germ of the disease which has since devoured the whole system of a representative government. With the disintegration of parties, elections have taken the character of personal struggles restricted by local interests and opinions, but independent of their primary purpose of subserving the advantage of the state. With the great increase of the numbers in Parliament, most of the members, apart from the interests of party strife, are characterized by indifference to public affairs. They neglect their duty of attendance at all sessions and of direct participation in the consideration of business. Thus, the work of legislation and the direction of the gravest political affairs become a play composed of formality, compromise, and fiction. The system of representation has falsified itself in practice. These deplorable results are all the more manifest where the population of a country is of heterogeneous composition, comprising nationalities of many different races. The principle of nationality may be considered the touchstone which reveals the falseness and impracticability of parliamentary government. It is worthy of note that nationality first appeared as an active and irritant force in the government of the world when it came in contact with new forms of democracy. It is not easy to apprehend the nature of this new force and the ends which it pursues, but it is unquestionable that it contains the source of a grave and complex struggle impending in the history of humanity, and it is vain to predict to what issues this struggle will lead. Today we see the various races of composite states animated by passionate feelings of intolerance to the political institution which unites them in a single body, and by an equally passionate aspiration to independent government with their generally fictitious culture. We see this not only among those races which have had a history and a separate political life and culture, but to an equal extent among races which have never known independence. Autocracy succeeded in evading or conciliating such demands and outbreaks, not alone by means of force, but by the equalization of rights and relations under a unifying power. But democracy has failed to settle these questions, and the instinct of nationality serves as a disintegrating element. To the Supreme Parliament, each race sends representatives, not of common political interests, but of racial instincts, of racial exasperation, and of racial hatred, both to the dominant race, to the sister races, and to the political institution which unites them all. Such is the unharmonious consequence of parliamentary government in the composite states, as Austria, in our day, so vividly illustrates. Providence has preserved our Russia, with its heterogeneous racial composition, from like misfortunes. It is terrible to think that our condition if destiny had sent us the fatal gift, an all-Russian parliament, but that will never be. The advocates of representative institutions point to England as an illustration of their argument, But to this reference we might apply the proverb, "They hear a sound and know not where it is." Social science in our day has begun to investigate the historic and economic sources whence flow the particular institutions of the Anglo-Saxon, and to some extent of the Scandinavian races, in comparison with the institutions of the other European peoples. The Anglo-Saxon race, from the time it appeared on the stage of history up to the present day, has been distinguished by a strongly developed, independent personality. And in the political and economic sphere, this attribute of the Anglo-Saxon race has been bound indissolubly with the steadfastness of its ancient institutions, with the firm organization of its family life, with its local self-government, with its incomparable success which it has attained by its energetic action, and with the influence which it enjoys in both hemispheres. By means of this personal energy, it was able in the beginning of its history to overthrow the strange Norman customs of its conquerors, and to consolidate its polity on those principles which it preserves unchanged to the present day. The essential characteristic of this polity lies in the relation of the citizen to the state. From early youth, all are accustomed to independence, to fashion their own careers, and to earn their daily bread. Parents are not burdened with the duty of providing for the careers of their children, or of leaving them inheritances. Landlords maintain their own properties, and encourage husbandry and handicraft. Local government is carried on by the personal participation of the people, inspired by sentiments of duty. The administrative institutions work without an army of officials maintained by the state, and looking to it for affluence and advancement. On these bases developed the representative institutions of free England, and for these reasons its parliament is actually composed of representatives of local interests in close association with the land. For these reasons, its voice may be considered to a large extent as the voice of the people and as the organ of national interests. The other European communities were organized upon a different foundation, the foundation of common interests. Individuals were characterized by less than an independent life than by solidarity with the social alliance to which they belonged. Thence, in the course of social and political development sprang the personal dependence of individuals from some social alliance, and in the end of ends from the state. These alliances, being in the beginning firm institutions, family, political, religious, social, strongly supported men in life and action, and men in turn strongly upheld the social and political edifice. In the course of time, these alliances either were dissolved or lost their ancient political significance, yet men continued, as before, to seek assistance in the making of their careers from their families, their corporations, and finally from the state, whether monarchical or republican, and to lay on it the responsibility for misfortunes when these supports gave way. To put it shortly, each citizen looks to one of these powers to determine his career. Such a state of society is commonly found deficient in independent and self-reliant men who stand upon their own feet and master their fates, thus constituting an element of support to the state, while on the other hand, there exists a great multitude of men who seek support from the state, nourish themselves on its sap, and take from it much more than they give. Thence, in such society springs the immense increase on the one hand of the official class, and on the other hand of the so-called liberal professions. Thence, through decay of independent action, the extreme complexity of the administrative and legislative power which is obliged to provide for many, where each should be sufficient for himself. Society, in such a condition, gradually prepares for the advent of socialist doctrines, and general reliance upon the state to provide for the prosperity of all gives birth to the idiotic theory of state socialism. With such conditions of social development, the continental states established among themselves representative institutions on the Anglo-Saxon pattern, some with universal suffrage. It is plain that in the condition of society described above, with its light relation to social work, the people cannot elect true representatives of the land and of its immediate interests. The result of this we see in the deplorable fate of representative assemblies of Europe, in the burdensome and hopeless position of the governing power which is indissolubly bound with them and of the people whose fate upon them depends. What, then, shall we say of Slavonic races, peoples distinguished, as they are, by their particular polity and by the extreme youth of their culture, of Romanian, of unhappy Greece. Representative institutions established a disintegrating principle in the life of the Slavonic peoples, resembling, in some cases, a bitter caricature of the West, which reminds us of Krylof's fable, Martushko and the Spectacles. The greatest evil of constitutional government lies in the formation of ministries on parliamentary or party principles. Each political party aspires to seize the reins of government at any cost. The chief of the state must submit to the party which commands a majority in parliament. A ministry is formed from the members of this party to maintain itself in power, enters upon a contest with the opposition, which, in its turn, puts forth its whole strength to overthrow its rivals and take their places. If the chief of the state were to favor the minority and nominate his own ministry from its ranks, the new ministry would dissolve Parliament and direct all its strength towards gaining a majority at the general election, with the support of this majority being enabled to withstand the opposition. The placemen of the ministerial party vote always for the government, not for the sake of upholding authority, not for intimate community of opinion, but because this government in its turn supports the members of its party in power and in its concomitant privileges, advantages, and emoluments. The natural instincts of all parties is to support their own in all circumstances, either on account of a common interest or simply by virtue of their gregarious instinct which impels mankind to unite in societies and to march into battle side by side. It is evident, then, that unanimity of opinion has little influence, and that the pretended solicitude for the public welfare serves as the concealment of motives and instincts in no way related to it. This is the ideal of parliamentary government. It is a gross delusion to regard it as a guarantee of freedom. The absolute power of the sovereign is replaced by the absolute power of Parliament, with this difference only, that the person of the sovereign may embody a rational will, while in Parliament all depends upon accident, as the decisions of Parliament are brought about by the majority. But as, by the side of the majority, constituted under the influence of party gambling, a powerful minority exists, the will of the majority is in no way the will of Parliament. Still less can it be regarded as the will of the people, the healthy mass of which abstains from participation in the comedy of parties and turns away from it with abhorrence. On the other hand, the corrupt part of the population mingles willingly in politics, and thereby is driven to a worse corruption, for the chief motive of this comedy is appetite for power and plunder. Political freedom becomes a fiction maintained on paper by the paragraphs and phrases of the Constitution. The principles of monarchical power disappear. The liberal democracy triumphs, bringing into society disorder and violence, with the principles of infidelity and materialism, and proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity, where there is place neither for liberty nor for equality. Such conditions inevitably lead to anarchy, from which society can be saved alone by dictatorship, that is, by the rehabilitation of autocracy in the government of the world. The first example of representative government by the people was set to modern Europe by England. Towards the middle of the 8th century, French philosophers began to glorify English institutions as models for universal imitation, but at that time French intelligence was fascinated less by the principles of political freedom than by the principles of religious toleration, in other words, by the principle of unbelief disseminated by the English philosophers of the day. Once sanctioned by France, which then gave tone to the morals and the literature of the West, the fashion of English institutions spread over the whole European continent. Meantime, two great events took place, of which one confirmed this faith in representative institutions, while the other shook it to its foundations. The Republic of the United States of America was established, with its institutions, with the exceptions of monarchy and aristocracy, modeled on the institutions of England, took root on the new soil steadfastly and fruitfully. This success infatuated many minds, above all in France. On the other hand arose the French Republic, and horrified the world with the disorders and violence of a revolutionary government. Everywhere rose the cry of indignation and abhorrence of French and of all democratic institutions. The dread of revolution was imagined even in the internal politics of the British government. In 1815, Under the influence of political events, this feeling began to abate, and again, the intellect of Europe aspired to combine political freedom with civil order in forms resembling those of the English Constitution. Political Anglomania was fashionable once again. Then followed a series of attempts to realize the British ideal, first in France, then in Spain and Portugal, then in Holland and Belgium, and finally, in later times, in Germany, in Italy, and in Austria. A faint echo of this movement reached even Russia in 1825, in the insensate attempts of aristocratic visionaries, ignorant both of their countrymen and of their history. It is interesting to follow the history of the new democratic institutions and to contrast their instability with the steadfastness of monarchical institutions, the life of which is counted by centuries. In France, from the date of the establishment of political freedom, the government, in all its strength, was 3 times overthrown by the mob of Paris, in 1792, in 1830, and in 1848. 3 times it was overthrown by the army, or by military violence. On the 4th of September, 1797, when the majority of the Directory, with the cooperation of military forces, annulled the elections of 48 departments and exiled 56 members of the legislative assemblies. A second time, in 1797, 9th of November, the government was overthrown by Bonaparte, and finally, in 1851, 2nd December, by another Bonaparte, Napoleon III. 3 times the government was overthrown by invasion from without, in 1814, in 1815, and in 1870. Thus, from the beginning of its political experiments up till 1870, France has had approximately 44 years of freedom and 37 years of rigorous dictatorship. Here we may notice a remarkable fact. The monarchs of the elder branch of the Bourbons, who made great concessions to the demand for political freedom, at no time relied on the principle of modern democracy, while, on the other hand, the 2 Napoleons who governed France despotically preached this gospel without reserve. In Spain, popular government was proclaimed at the time of the final overthrow of Napoleon. An extraordinary session of Cortes at Cadiz confirmed the Constitution, proclaiming in its first article that the sovereign power belonged to the people. Ferdinand VII, having been established in Spain by France, annulled this constitution and began to govern autocratically. In 6 years, General Riego, at the head of a military insurrection, forced the king to re-establish the constitution. In 1823, at the instigation of the Holy Alliance, the French army entered Spain and re-established Ferdinand in despotism. His widow, as regent, accepted the constitution anew for the preservation of her daughter's rights against Don Carlos. Then began for Spain a series of rebellions and revolts, rarely interrupted by short intervals of comparative tranquility. It is enough to point out that, from the year 1816 to the accession of Alfonso XIII, there were in Spain nearly 40 military revolts with the participation of the people. Speaking of Spain, we may notice the monstrous spectacle presented by the republics of South America, republics of Spanish origin and Spanish manners. The history of these republics records an uninterrupted series of sanguinary conflicts between the people and the army, interrupted by the rule of despots, who remind us of Commodus or Caligula. It is enough to mention Bolivia, where of 14 presidents of the republic, 13 ended their careers by violent death or in exile. The establishment of representative government in Germany and Austria dates only to 1848. It is true that as early as 1815, the dull rumbling of the young intelligence of Germany was heard demanding the fulfillment of promises given to the people in the days of the Great War of Deliverance. But, with a few trifling exceptions, representative institutions did not exist in Germany before 1847, when the King of Prussia established a peculiar form of constitutional government which lasted no longer than a year. But it needed only the success of the Paris mob in destroying the French charter and dethroning their constitutional king to revive in Germany the popular movement with the cooperation of the army. In Berlin, in Vienna, and Frankfurt, national assemblies were established on the model of the French. Hardly a year had passed when the government overthrew them by military violence. The modern constitutions of Germany and Austria emanated from the will of the sovereign and still await the judgment of history. This has been Mr. Patriarch. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, links to PayPal and Subscribe Star can be found below. Please join us next time for Chapter 4, Trial by Jury, of Konstantin Pobyedonostseeff's Reflections of a Russian Statesman.